We're going to talk about intentional torts, the torts against people. Now, there are a number of them. The ones we're going to talk about in these series of videos are the most common. And you'll also recognize some of this terminology and say, hey, are we talking about a crime here? This is where we cross into crime territory. We're going to hear things like assault and battery and false imprisonment. These also constitute crime, but if you remember from other videos you may have watched, a crime is a wrong against society, and a person can be punished for those acts, and the point of those punishments with a crime is to deter the person from doing it again and to deter others from engaging in that kind of conduct. When we talk about torts, it's the person who the conduct was against. These folks can sue for damages or compensation as a result of the conduct of the individual. So they can be punished by society for breaking a law or the crime, but in turn they also can be sued for damages, and we call that a tort, and that's done by the actual victim who was injured. So this series of video, we're going to talk about assault and battery. The next one, we'll talk about false imprisonment, fraud, and defamation. So assault, what is it? It is slightly different than what you might hear for a crime. An assault is an act that creates a reasonable apprehension or fear of immediate harmful or offensive contact. You might think that, oh, well, maybe this is kind of like an attempt, an attempt assault if we're talking about a crime. But in the tort world, it is an act that creates a reasonable apprehension or fear of immediate harmful or offensive contact. Apprehension does not equal fear. What apprehension equals is if the contact is such that a reasonable person would want to avoid it, and there is a reasonable basis for believing that the contact will occur. Then you have apprehension. There's no touching involved here. This is primarily focuses on the mind of the plaintiff, where they an apprehension. So let's talk about the next component, then we'll put this together with some examples. So if we have the apprehension or fear of a contact, the battery is an unexcused and harmful or offensive physical contact intentionally performed. It could be this, so this is like the follow-through of assault, and this could be the slightest of touching that can constitute a battery if there's an injury or an offense to a person, and we're thinking about the person of ordinary sensibilities. We can have someone who's oversensitive. It depends on the contact. We're talking about what a objective or ordinary person with reasonable sensibilities would feel in that moment. So battery is the completion of the act that caused the apprehension in the assault. So let's talk about some examples. So let's take this example. Ivan enters Crown Convenience, a small neighborhood store, pulls out a handgun. He demands the money from the cash register from Jean, the store clerk, and once Jean gives Ivan the money, he shoots her. Now you might be saying, hey, this sounds like robbery, and it would be. In the criminal world, the police would come, he would be arrested, and he would be punished in some way. But Jean here might have some civil grounds, right? Do we have an assault? Well, sure. We have Ivan pointing the gun at Jean. That's an assault, right? If the contact is such that a reasonable person would want to avoid that contact that could potentially come, the apprehension of that coming contact. And then we have the contact, which is a battery, firing the gun and hitting Jean with the bullet. So we have two components here that Jean could potentially sue under and be compensated for. How about you borrow money from me a month ago? You borrowed money from me a month ago. You're supposed to pay me back in a week, and you haven't. So I call you up today and demand my money. And I say, if you don't pay me within 24 hours, I'll get you. Is this an assault? Are you in apprehension of fear of a unwanted touching? Well, maybe, but it's not happening right at that moment, right? This is something that's going to happen in the future. So there is no immediate threat here of some physical violence. So the threat in the future, not enough. These kinds of words, not enough. You need the actual action. Mary's walking down the street and Bob runs up behind her, snatches her purse off her shoulder. Do we have an assault and battery here? Well, do we have an assault? Is she placed in apprehension of fear of a unwanted touching? Probably not, because she doesn't know it's coming, right? It's coming up behind her. What about the battery? Do we have the battery? He doesn't actually touch her, but what does he do? He touches something connected to her body. So you don't actually need someone to actually touch the person. You can grab something or take something off their person. So we have a battery here. What if Bob throws a rock in her direction and hits her? He set something in motion. He set, just like the gun idea, he pulled the trigger Ivan pulled the trigger in the example a couple ago. How about Bob throws a rock at Mary and she sees it coming and she ducks and the rock hits Chuck in the back of the head, who's Chuck's right next to her. The question is, can Mary sue Bob? Sure she could. Assault. She saw the rock coming. Apprehension, even though she got out of the way. Certainly, if she has some injury. But she could have a case for assault. I don't mention whether or not she suffered an injury, but certainly maybe there's some pain and suffering, maybe there's some shock. Who knows what Mary would have for an injury, but for the point of this example, she could potentially have an assault case. Can Chuck sue Bob? I should say, can Chuck sue Bob? Chuck can't sue Chuck, but can Chuck sue Bob? And the answer is yes, he can, right? He gets hit with the rock, a battery. And one more example to finish out this discussion of assault and battery. An executive who gives an unwanted sexual caress to a secretary. Can the secretary sue? And since we're talking about assault and battery, the answer is going to be yes, relative to the battery, right? Relative to the battery, the unwanted touch would constitute here. We would not have an assault because the act doesn't create, well, it doesn't suggest that we create in the person the reasonable apprehension or fear of an immediate offensive contact. We just have an unwanted offensive contact in this situation. Could we try and make an argument for assault? Possibly. I think battery is the strongest one here. You might be thinking, what about sexual harassment? Absolutely. That's under a different body of law. But for purposes of here, we certainly have an intentional tort that was committed. All right, next video is going to talk about the rest of the intentional torts against persons.